Okay, when I start reading the names who are on this dedicated panel, I will not end.
Finally.
First, I call on stage Farida Rustamova, journalist from Moscow originally, and Mariana Katzarova, UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Russia. Welcome, Sam Greene, the Director of the Democratic Resilience Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome, Sam. Stefan Meister, who is already on stage, Professor of Law and Administration at the University of Helsinki. No, sorry. What did I read wrong? I wrong remembered. He's still the head of the Center for Order and Governance in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Central Asia of the German Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Stefan. And Marianna Muravyeva, Professor of Law and Administration at the University of Helsinki, a chair that she did not inherit from Stefan Meister.
Okay.
And a specialization in women's rights and violence against women. Anna Kuleshova, Social Foresight Group. Welcome. And Ivan Fomin, the researcher and faculty member of the Master's Degree Program of Russian Studies of the Boris Nemtsov educational program at the Charles University in Prague. Very, very welcome. The floor is yours.
Yeah, really? Okay. Shall we start? Hi, everyone, again. My name is Farida Rustamova, and I'm a political journalist for more than 10 years now. I'm honored to be today's moderator of this discussion, and it's actually my first time as a moderator, so please don't be very hard on me. Yes, and without any further introductions, I think we should start. And I think it will be right thing to start from Ms. Mariana Katzarova, Special Rapporteur on human rights in Russia. We know that you've made, a couple of weeks ago, you've made your first report to the United Nations. Could you please tell us about your findings?
How many minutes do we have? Thank you. First of all, thank you very much and good afternoon. Здравствуйте. Я буду говорить не по-русски, а буду говорить по-английски, потому что это легче для всех. Но могу и по-русски, с удовольствием. I think we need a gender training right away. Look how we set. We're boy, 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 girl, girl, girl. I mean, really, we should kind of mix, gentlemen, but the next time. Great. Now we can start.
That's politically correct, yeah.
No, I mean, it's how the world is, right? So, about the report, my mandate was voted, first of all, it was created after a huge efforts by the Russian civil society, but also the international civil society, and many of you in this room have been really involved in trying to advocate for years for a mandate of a UN Special Rapporteur on human rights in Russia to be created. Of course, this was a distant dream, and it was unthinkable before the terrible full-scale attack against Ukraine last year. I remember the times I was close friends with Anna Politkovskaya, and when Anna was killed, we were trying to prevent others from being killed. And we were talking, and from my NGO, you know, talking as a civil society to donors to around the world, and they were saying, oh no, we cannot support you because, you know, we're doing business with Russia. And we're having our offices in Russia. So no, you know, a killed Russian journalist, no. I started an award in Anna's name 17 years ago, and it has been going strong. It's the Anna Politkovskaya Award. This is in my private capacity for women from war and conflict around the world. Now, unfortunately, after the horrible events of February last year, when the neighbors of the Russian Federation, Ukraine, has been subjected to a brutal attack, which is continuing to this date. The creation of the mandate of the UN Special Rapporteur on Russia became possible only because the world suddenly woke up and saw the level of human rights violations, which actually aren't news to us. They have, as I said, been continuing in the past 20 years at least. And the deterioration of the human rights situation in Russia has been going on progressively for the past 2 decades. But since February last year, the situation became really grave. All of the movement by the authorities to silence the dissident voices in the Russian Federation progressively, with, for example, the introduction of the draconian foreign agents law in 2012. It's not a new development. In order to silence the voices of civil society, of the human rights defenders, since February last year, it really rapidly deteriorated with a myriad of laws and amendments to laws that have been done by the authorities in order to really to destroy the voice of civil society, of independent media, and of anybody who has dissident views, to begin with anti-war, against the war in Ukraine, on Ukraine, but also on any other issues. I recently met a group of indigenous people from the Russian Federation, leaders of the indigenous communities, who actually shared with me that even environmental protests or protests to defend their ancestral land from draconian oil companies who are trying to destroy their land in the name of profit. But also there is nothing like independent business in the Russian Federation. These huge business companies, as you know, are connected to the higher power of the government. They have been silenced as well. Indigenous people's organizations have been closed. And of course, the leading human rights organizations, more than 600 NGOs were closed down or forced to close down. To begin with, Memorial, the Moscow-Helsinki group, the Sakharov Center, and many, many more. There is virtually no independent media in Russia. And there is more than 22,000 people, anti-war activists who were detained, and many of them are still in detention, including being subjected to torture, ill treatment, and sexual violence against both men and women in police custody, only because you're an anti-war activist. Cultural figures, poets, writers, actors, many of them left the country, but others who voiced their anti-war views have been imprisoned, are facing long prison sentences, not to mention the dissidents and the political opponents like Vladimir Kara-Murza, who received 25 years imprisonment, like Navalny, like Ilya Yashin, Oleg Orlov, the leader of the Nobel Prize winning Memorial, was on trial for, what's the exact allegation? It's for connected to destroying the reputation of the Russian army. Why? Because on the first day of the war, when the war broke up, when the Russian Federation attacked Ukraine, he came out on the Red Square on a lone picket to demonstrate against the war with a placard. And then he repeated it a couple of times. So for that, he was facing up to 3 years and more imprisonment. Thank God, maybe because he's really enormously well-known human rights defender, and Memorial is a Nobel Prize winner. The judge decided so far to give him a fine several days ago during his trial. But really nobody is exempt from being either imprisoned in Russia, or, I mean, these are even school children, their teachers. As you know, in Russian schools, there are mandatory classes that are lessons about the important, and the important is a propaganda about the Ukrainian nation, that it's not a nation, or about the so-called special military operation, the war in Ukraine. So basically, anybody who refuses to be part of these classes, a child or a teacher, have been persecuted by the authorities. And we know cases, as you know, the infamous case of a girl drawing anti-war a drawing, and her father is now imprisoned. Teachers have lost their jobs. But also, I always remember you know, the phrase of the famous Russian writer Duvlatov, who used to say, now you're talking against Mr. Stalin, who is single-handedly responsible for all these millions of people that perished in the Gulag. But who wrote the 5 million donosy? Who wrote these denunciations? So I grew up in a totalitarian society. I'm Bulgarian. I grew up during communist times in Bulgaria, and I know how neighbors turn into informants, how relatives turn into, you know, informants to the authorities. Because in a totalitarian society, the climate of fear, the climate of repression brings our deepest fears and also the deepest desire to survive in this society. So, of course, it's very important that we remember, and there was some voices this conference, you know, saying, oh, but nobody in Russia, there is silence, nobody is protesting, nobody is actively opposing what's happening. I totally stand by the findings of my report that there are enormous amount of people that are against the war. There are enormous amount of people that are against the policies of repression, of closing down civil society. To begin with, this one, who lost his life, because the war in Ukraine didn't start in February, it started in 2014, and now continued as, I call it the first armed conflict. I was in Donetsk, I was leading the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Donbass for 2 years at the beginning of this conflict, 2014, 2016. So this full-fledged brutal attack on Ukraine in February last year is a continuation of what was happening already for 9 years. So, and there has been people, including Boris Nemtsov, but others, these 22,000, but many more, who has been risking their lives, and many of you who are in this room, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers. You know what happened yesterday with 3 of Navalny's lawyers being detained and charged on completely unrelated to their defense of their client charges, but we know that it's because they're persecuted, because they are Navalny's lawyers. And we have in this room human rights lawyers, Russian human rights lawyers, who's been risking their lives to defend the dissidents and to defend the journalists and the human rights defenders. And what kind of society, on what level is this society when you cannot have a defense lawyer to represent you in court? So I think, You can read my report. It's online. I won't run through it, but I want to say that it's the situation with human rights in Russia is grave. I could only compare it as intensity and as darkness of repression really to the 1930s. I could compare it to the Stalinist terror. Yes, people are not disappearing en masse to gulags, but there are more sophisticated ways to keep the fear going and to stifle the entire society. First of all, there is virtually no independent media in Russia, virtually no civil society in Russia. And when you don't have a civil society, you don't have a voice. And of course, if you are just a normal person trying to survive through dark times, and it doesn't matter that you're against the war, if you in any way like a pro-Ukrainian Facebook post, or if you say something to your neighbors because you don't know whether they'll report you, and they're one of those 5 million that Duvlatov was talking about, you're facing 15 years, you're facing 25 years imprisonment, virtually your life being spent in prison because of your opposition to the war or because of your dissident views. I have a set of recommendations to the Russian government, but I also have a set of recommendations to the world governments and to the European Union and to anybody else. The Russian government is not recognizing my mandate. The ambassador in Geneva came out on Russia 24 to call me an active Russophobe. And when the journalist asked, but why is she active Russophobe? She's Bulgarian. He said, well, look where she worked before. And I worked at the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I worked at Amnesty International. If these are Russophobic organizations, I don't know. So my call is again to the Russian authorities. It's actually in their vested interest to communicate with my mandate. I'm an independent expert, and I will be very happy to, in person, in discussion with them, advocate for the release of all the political prisoners, for changing, totally reforming the draconian set of laws to stifle civil society, media, and political opponents. But we can only do that in a dialogue, and I want to hear their opinion as well, because they're a very important stakeholder here. They're members of the UN. They are one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and the Security Council is the one that decides whether there'll be peace or war in the world, because that's what the Security Council does. So a country with such level of repression on their domestic level is actually in their hands is vested the decision about other conflicts in the world and other situations of human rights violations. So it's extremely important that Russia becomes a different society. That's why I have been saying to the governments of the world and the European governments to begin with, do not isolate the Russian people. Continue giving scholarships to the young Russians. Continue and invest in protection of the defenders from Russia, of those brave individuals who continue to risk their lives being on the line to bring the voice of the people, of the victims of human rights violations. And there are a number of European countries that have now new provisions of their ministries of interior. They're not allowing Russian citizens in their countries, including the victims of human rights violations, including the human rights activists, the defenders, the journalists, the dissidents, and those brave men that actually decided not to participate in the war on Ukraine by escaping mobilization. They're particularly to be honored by us in our societies. Because as I always say, not many people know, there is a small monument, it's not even in Germany, it's in Austria, of 11,000 men during World War II who were objectors. They objected to join Hitler's army. They were immediately executed, but they knew they will be executed, but they risked it. So anybody who is an objector to participating in this war deserves protection and deserves our attention and our support. there is no such thing as honorary conscientious objection in Russia for mobilized men, only for there is alternative military service, but it doesn't apply to mobilization. And mind you, you should know that not all people that are men that are fighting on the front line are there because they wanted to be there, especially in the regions, in Siberia, in the indigenous people's lands. The mobilization was draconian, and the NGOs helped me know about this and inform me about these mobilization methods. A bus stops in a small village in the middle of the night, and door to door, the military commission goes and kidnaps the men in the house to send them to war in Ukraine. So these people, there has been torture, there has been other forms of brutality against men to go and fight. So not everybody is there because they want to be in this war. So yes, maybe I should,
yeah, thank you very
they're
much,
giving me signs.
Yeah.
But
we'll
yes,
have a chance to
I will be happy to answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you. Moving to a very controversial topic, Dr. Sam Greene. Not you, but public opinion in Russia. What is crucial to understand about public opinion in Russia at this point of time, more than 1.5 years into the war, and what role public opinion has or hasn't in modern Russia?
Somebody this morning, I think, started by saying the problem we have in discussing the role of ideology is that we can't agree on what ideology is. Right? And I think we have the same problem with a lot of issues. Public opinion is one of them, right? We could go around this room and we have lots of people saying there's no such thing as public opinion in an authoritarian system. Lots of different ways of trying to measure it. And so kind of part of me wants to avoid the question. Another part of me wants to avoid the question simply because, I mean, I'm looking out at an important part of the Russian public, and there's a bit of imposter syndrome sitting here trying to explain to people what your opinion is. But you asked about understanding, and the title of our session focuses on understanding. I think this is part of the problem. We have actually a fair amount of data. We don't have as much data as we used to have before. We don't have as much data as we would like. I would love to be able to get in the field and match up survey data with ethnographic data and in-depth interviews and focus groups, and I can't do it. Maybe someday I'll be able to, but it won't be the way we were able to do it before for a long time. But we have, a fair amount of polls out there. We can have a conversation later about whether we believe the numbers. I don't think there's a problem with the numbers, frankly, but that's my position. But we look at the numbers and we don't understand them, right? And this is true whether we're talking about public opinion or so many other things. Right? We've been talking about, how Russia got into this war. We didn't talk about Prigozhin, but we could, right? We could talk about all these things happening, the behavior of the Russian elite, the behavior of the Russian public. We see what's happening. We don't understand the cause and effect mechanism that's making it happen, right? And so as analysts, as social scientists, as activists, as citizens, I think we struggle with understanding as such. Now, what do we see on public opinion? Basically, we see stability, right? So we have seen public opinion numbers both in terms of the absolute level of people supporting Putin and the absolute level with some fluctuation, but mostly within the realm of statistical significance. The structure of public opinion, whether it's by age or by other socio-demographic categories, hasn't changed much over the course of the last 18, 19 months. And we've seen all these things that we would have expected, right, to have some impact on public opinion, right? So we've seen a war that's lasted, 19 months instead of 3 days, right? We've seen pictures of burning Ukrainian cities make their way back one way or another to the Russian public. I don't believe that, while, yes, propaganda plays a role, people broadly seem to be aware of at least a lot of the things that are going on there. They see the body bags coming home. They see the drones hitting Moskva City, right? They see all these things, Prigozhin, Girkin, right? All these things that could have had an impact on public opinion and don't, right? So my sense, and this is only mine, right? But my sense is that what we're seeing reflected in the opinion polls is not so much a reflection of what people are thinking about the war as a sense that people are not thinking about the war. Right? It's a reflection of the basic understanding that people have of the role that the state and their relationship with the state plays in their life, right? And as we've heard in the previous session, in fact, talking with Sergei Gurdjieff and Damon Wilson, right? Most people in Russia, I think, have come to see over the last 30, 40 years, going back to the late Soviet experience, the state is not terribly important in their lives. It can make life worse. You really don't expect the state to make life any better for you, whether it's Putin in charge or whoever might come next. But what does matter in your life, right, is the relationship that you have with everybody around you, right? The people around your kitchen table, the people you go to work with, your neighbors, the people you rely on to get through what can be, especially now, a rather uncertain and anxious existence. And so what you need to do is to project to those people that you are trustworthy, you're normal. The Russian word for this is much better than the English one, adekvatnost, right? This idea that you kind of understand how the world works, right? And if you are in an authoritarian environment in which every, toaster, right, is telling you that 86% of the population supports Putin, you're not going to project your adekvatnost by saying, I don't support Putin, unless you happen to be in that 14%, right, where you're also surrounded only by like people in this room, right, who don't support Putin and don't support the war, right? So that's what has remained the same over the last 19 months, right? That sense is not changing. And while I take a lot of what Mariana was saying as true, there is a lot more fear in the system than there used to be. I think what people remain mostly fearful of is not getting hit on the head from the top, right, from the state. It's mostly getting hit on the head from the side, right, from your peers who might turn you into the state, but who might also just turn away from you, might ostracize you, might be less likely to trust you, right? So that's the bad news. None of the tragedy, none of the chaos, none of the difficulties that this war has caused, right, has given us any reason to believe that anything is going to change anytime soon. The good news is that if we look around the world at authoritarian systems historically, we have very rarely, if ever, had signs that things were going to change anytime soon. And then they do. So we have a lack, and I'll end with this. We have a sense of both uncertainty and I think a kind of depressing kind of certainty. Again, Mariana said, you have the experience of Bulgaria. We can read Václav Havel and Czesław Miłosz and people who've lived through these sorts of environments. You think about the parable of the greengrocer, from Havel. It all seems very familiar and it all seems very inescapable. But we can also remember that all of those things ended, and I think that is important to bear in mind. But others will have more to say on that, so I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. A bit depressing, but.
Can't outdo Michael Kaufman.
Now I want to move to relationships between society and the government. Since the beginning of the war, a lot of experts are saying that the previous social contract between society and the authorities has changed. And I want to address to Dr. Stefan Meister. Could you please tell us what do we know about the current regime and society relations?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and also the opportunity to speak here. We did a scenario workshop a month ago, and we're looking into Ukraine, into the war, and into Russia, what a ceasefire agreement would mean. So is there an opportunity for a ceasefire agreement? I'm coming to this question. I just wanted to go from the angle we were just looking into it. I think the result is that there is no ceasefire agreement. At the moment, I think it's a very much discussion here in our societies, but it has nothing to do with the parties in this war, neither in Ukraine nor in Russia. I think we had already the discussion before. I think what we see with regard to the Russian society is this kind of lock-in effect in fear and repression. and propaganda, and also the support for the state in a situation of war. And very much focus also on the state. But I think this element of fear and repression, which has been growing, and everybody can be the target of repression. I think that locks in the society and also the parts of the elite, or the elite in the end, into the support with the regime and with this war. And I think what we see with those who support in key positions the government or the decision of Putin in the end to survive, to keep the economy running, which we called in the past so-called system liberals, yeah, some of them, let's call it like this. I think nearly none of them were able to leave. So they are not allowed to leave, and they have to serve also the system. I think what we see is a shift to a war economy. More money will be spent on the war next year, and we see a redistribution also of assets from private ownership into state ownership. And we see a redistribution also of money among the society, and in particular to those regions, more poor regions, where people live who went into the army. So I think it's ethnic regions, it's less developed region where a lot of money comes in because of that soldiers, yes, of dead men in the end. So you see also there are winners in a way of the war in the system, which has an interest to keep these assets, but there is also a lot of money spent on the society in the society to those who lost their relatives. I think that has also an impact on the society and power relationship. And I think as long as money is coming in, as long as it's possible to spend money, this war machine will run. And I think that's again also about the sanctions we have discussed, and also the difficulties to close these gaps. My impression is that, so I think economists clearly say, maybe that's the other point, you cannot stop this war at this point because it would mean a collapse of the economy, and there is an interest to keep the war. And it is also, it's becoming system imminent in a way, because it legitimizes the regime. You can partly mobilize also against the enemy. And the system has an interest to run a constant war and to keep this society locked into this situation. So I think that's really the main problem, also as an outcome of this workshop we had. That the logic of the war is becoming more and more the logic of the legitimization of the regime, how the economy is running, and how the society is organized, and the system is able also to increase the production of weapons, and everything serves also the war, and I think really the problem also, which has to be understood here, as long as there is a decision to support Ukraine in a way that it's not losing the war, but it is not winning the war. I think this is not what we're doing. Yeah, we are supporting Ukraine and not losing the war. I think, and as long as Putin in a way has the escalation dominance, he will keep this war, and he will keep this war for as long as he has resources. So I think this is how I would see it. Yeah. So and we have to think about it in terms of our own strategy in short, middle, and long term. We have not discussed. We should not have these kind of imitating discussions about ceasefire and how to get into this situation when you understand that this regime has no interest to stop the war and would use maybe a ceasefire just to reorder or to recover in a way also for going on with the war. So I think that would be the main points on this.
Thank you very much. I think we'll be back in our question section to the sanctions and to the interests of the system in continuation of the war. But now I wanted to talk about cultural dynamics. And Professor Marianna Muravyeva, my question is to you. We all know that Russian authorities are trying to isolate Russian society in many ways, but especially in a cultural way that's trying to impose those so-called traditional values. Could you please tell us more on how Putin's government carries on with this cultural sovereignty discourse?
Okay, thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel. But so I will focus, and I have April thesis. So, you know, the older generation should remember the Lenin's April thesis. So I have like 8 of them. So I'm going to look up my notes, and I'm talking today as an academic, but also as an activist who spent 30 years in the field of human rights of women and human rights of LGBTQI people, queer people. Well, first of all, cultural sovereignty is this operating framework that not is just for the government to use, but unfortunately it's a framework that is in use in certain sectors of the society as well. It's not formulated like that, but we can see the indications of how cultural sovereignty is operating at the level when Russian government talks to the international bodies, and since the beginning of the war, it became much more clearer than before, because before we all sort of hoped that the resistance that Russian government is showing, especially in the localizing or in the ratification of certain international conventions, the Istanbul Convention is one of the good examples of how contentious that become the relationship between Russia and the Council of Europe, first of all. But unfortunately, cultural sovereignty, as is obvious from the research that we've done on the debate around domestic violence legislation in 2019, but also monitoring the discourses, legal discourses, as well as mass media discourses in 2021, and then since the beginning of the war, 22-23, shows that actually cultural sovereignty is not just the concept that the government uses in their relationship to the international organizations, but it's also the concept that is pretty accepted in a society in a way that people, although they don't know the definition, but they exhibit the signs that they accept the idea that there is a certain tradition and there is a certain culture and that should be respected, and therefore us having this tradition and culture is a normal way of operating. And as I'm pretty sure you've all heard the variation of all that at some point expressed by Putin or whatever, whoever is there in the field. Ironically, the reference here is often to other countries. Oh, well, look at Britain, and they didn't ratify Istanbul Convention either. Or look at Germany. Constitutional Court in Germany also does not follow the decisions of European Court of Human Rights and argue that German constitution has priority over the European Court of Human Rights decisions, blah, blah, blah. And it's interesting to see how you sort of use the concept to localize this resistance, but also sort of provide the society also with certain sectors of society with the argument that we're doing what normal people are doing. And normal people, of course, are the Western countries. And that dynamic is very, very interesting to me, also as a researcher, but also as someone who has to interact with different sectors, NGOs, lawyers, academics, just normal people sometimes. Cultural sovereignty makes a lot of notions and concepts very contentious, and in my field, two big contentious issues is around feminism and around gender, and of course around human rights. Now, women's rights are human rights, right? We know that. There's a very simple statement, but there seems to be a lack of understanding of the simple statements in the Russian Federation for the past, after the Soviet Union collapsed, but for the past 30 years in the post-Soviet situation. And cultural sovereignty is a concept that also accounts for that when women's rights are reduced to the social problem. So whenever we talk about women's rights, it's all about benefits and children and family, and that sort of way of reverting that discourse to and reducing that to the social problems also reduces women's agency and creates the situation when women's organizations, feminist organizations, although they are a valid part of civil society, very important for development of civil society, are not just shunned by the government, we sort of expect that, but are also shunned by other NGOs that would view women's rights as part of a general right. So why should we have that specific way of dealing with women's rights when we have the common human rights discourse? Women are humans, right? Right. One of the explanations to that, and the cultural sovereignty actually provides quite a good view at that, is that the tradition that cultural sovereignty pushes for is not, I mean, it's a particular specific tradition that exists in Russia, and that's a very much heritage of legislation and policy coming from the Soviet times. It's a result of a radical social engineering that the Soviet Union has done in relation to gender discourse and gender equality, but reverted in the 90s in a very bourgeois sort of traditional way of discussing like women really don't want to work, want to look nice and stay at home, which of course never happened. But the discourse was there, and sort of using this discourse and sort of trying to put women into that framework created this loop in which the government, but also some conservative organizations within the conservative mobilization can operate with that. The problem is that women in this situation look for the way out. And they also become the electorate for Putin. They become also the support for certain conservative organizations. Well, not all women, of course, but if you look at conservative, for example, organizations like RVS, the parental resistance, or 40x40, Sorok Sarakov, and others that are still there, you can see mostly feminized support for that, which is, of course, very sad, but at the same time, we keep and should be keeping asking questions as to why women prefer to go to support or be part of conservative parental organizations rather than to be part of feminist, right, women's organizations in a way. That's also a big question of anti-gender movement, of course, in Europe, and it's been asked also in other contexts, in Poland and in Germany, here in Hungary, in other parts, in Argentina for that matter. So it's a global movement, of course, but also in the Russian case. Those women already had human rights, right? But how come they ended up giving up the rights, right, to be willing participants of the discourse? So what is to be done? And following the famous question, as I'm on this thesis, I can't see Luba from Anti-Feminist War Resistance, and because the light is right in my eyes, I can see her. But anyway, that is the voice that needs to be heard and amplified. And we work with local people, we regionalize, we speak their language, and I don't just mean Russian, but there's also Tatar, Chechen, Avar, Ruluk, Lak, Tabarsan, and Gush, Ukrainian, Mordva, Udmurt, and all these languages. And as women, we're actually very sensitive to that. I've worked quite a lot with regional organizations myself. And knowing the languages, I'm bilingual as well, so I'm not really Slavic. Having that sensitivity allows us to reach out to the audiences and talk to them, and also think about what could we do. We also continue to support them, and that we continue to build free and future Russia. That is impossible without free and safe women, right? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I want to talk a bit more about ideological issues. There's an ongoing discussion, and a lot of things that were mentioned today sort of prove it, about whether Russia has already gone full totalitarian or not. And I want to ask Mr. Ivan Fomin to guide us through this ideological shifts within the regime after the war began.
Yes, thank you. I believe this growing role of ideology is one of the important trends of this couple of years. But at the same time, it's a tricky thing to describe because, different people mean different things when they speak about ideology. So, and in some sense, Putin still doesn't have an ideology, like with the uppercase I, ideology like this big, detailed narrative about where the nation should go and why and how it will get there. But Putin does have, or at least he tries to develop, a kind of lowercase I ideology as a set of values that can be used to indoctrinate the population and then can be used to justify all sorts of policies and decisions. And in that sense, the last couple of years shows the regime is becoming more explicit about those efforts. We see the special presidential decree about the protection of traditional values. We also see those programs in schools and universities aimed at this ideological indoctrination. So there's a clear effort to create some kind of ideology. We still should see whether the regime will succeed. And actually, last couple of years also was a big test for that ideology because it's the first time that the regime had to actually explain to Russian people why they have to go and die for something. And you have to really have some good arguments in that kind of situation. And I believe what this situation showed is that there is a difference between having an ideology and relying on it. And it seems that the Kremlin still doesn't feel it can rely on that ideology. So, we can see that the way those narratives about demobilization are broadcasted, they show that it's usually some kind of combination of kind of these high ideals, traditional values, and all kinds of stuff, but it's also some necessary words about money and social benefits and other kind of compensation. So it seems that the regime itself is not confident about this ideology, but clearly it is ready to invest a lot of resources into it. The educational courses, these patriotic upbringing courses is just one of the examples here. And it is a worrying trend because it is true that we don't know. We have a lot of data about Russian public opinion, but it's difficult to interpret it. But one of the things we do know is that there is this generational gap in Russian public opinion, that the younger people are less often supportive of the regime in general, about Putin, about the war, and so on. And it is worrying to see that those brainwashing policies are specifically targeted at that younger audience. And so a big question, I think, it will define the Russian future in many ways, is whether the regime will be able to revert this trend with the generational gap, whether it will be able to effectively indoctrinate the youth into this ideology, whatever form it will have. There's actually a field for action for civil society here, because civil society has to just counter the propaganda, but it's not only about countering propaganda, it's also about avoiding and countering isolation, because what is really dangerous is to have the country that is not just brainwashed, but it's a country that is locked from alternative sources of information and then brainwashed. And this is the situation we're approaching now. It is not yet a reality, and I hope it will not be, but this is something we can all fight against.
Thank you. And now let's move a bit from Russia itself and take a look at the host countries where a lot of Russians have been moving since the start of the war. I think many people in this audience can relate to this. Ms. Anna Kuleshova, could you please tell us about your research? Who are these people and how they impact those countries that they move to? For example, Armenia and Serbia, those countries you have researched as far as I know?
Thank you so much. Yes, we conducted research in 5 countries: Armenia, Kazakhstan, Israel, Serbia, and Turkey. And so first of all, I'll say just a few words about those Russians who left Russia after the beginning of the war. Usually people ask about Russian diasporas out of Russia. But in fact, the most part of these people, they do not want to be associated with Russia, with Russian citizen government, and they do not share ideas of modern Russia, and they feel themselves as a part of European society because they share values, European values and democratic values. And they want their children to live in freedom and in democratic countries. And a lot of the people, they are well educated and they have profession and they are open-minded. And when we speak about them and when they speak about themselves, usually they speak about some kind of points of convergence. It's better to say than diasporas, I think, because the first one is sharing of the same destiny. All of them left Russia and left their homes and they are not sure about their future, and the only thing they know that they do not want to live in totalitarianship. And another thing, another point of convergence is there's professions. So we can see IT teams and actors teams and building teams, etc. And in each time, you can see that in these teams, people not from Russia only. They can be from Belarus and Ukraine and from Russia, and they work together. And I've heard today that politicians said that it's impossible, but we see that it's possible. And the last, but not least, point of convergence is religion and nationalities. Russia is a very, very big country, as you know, and some of people speak about themselves nowadays as about, for example, as about Bashkirs or as about Muslims, but not as about Russians. And they want, they do not want to be associated with modern Russia. If to speak about economies, certainly these 5 countries, Armenia, Serbia, Turkey, Kazakhstan, Israel, they're really, really different. And it's difficult to speak about them and compare them, but what we can say, in fact, a long story short, that some of countries, they made a decision about open migration policy for these Russian people and about closed migration policy for these Russian people. And they got Armenia and Serbia, these countries who decided to be open in their migration policies, they got great benefits for their economics. So I don't want to be sure about GDP. So we can see that Armenia's GDP grew by 12.6%, and in Serbia 4.5, and other countries, Kyrgyzstan 7%, Georgia 10%, etc. So after the arrival of Russians in Armenia and Serbia, they saw noticeable changes, and they got a lot of professionals, and nowadays they have own IT hubs in these countries, and they have new cultural programs, new educational programs, and it's good for them, good for these host countries. But the main problem of that people who move to these countries, they do not have any kind of representations there, and usually you can find Russian houses in many, many countries of the world, but they were founded by Putin's regime. But and people who left Russia because of the war, they can't even imagine to go to these houses and to work there and to make any kind of entrepreneurial activities there, but they do not have their own representatives. And this is a problem because it isn't enough to have somebody in European Parliament, but they need to be representative in these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And before moving to the question section, I want to give the floor to Ms. Olga Kaloeva, an activist, a member of Female Anti-War Resistance. She will tell us about the role of Russian regions in the anti-war effort.
Is it on?
Yes. I think you can.
I can stand there. Yeah, I can stand there. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'm sorry, I will read because I didn't have enough time. So, my name is Olga. I am part of the decolonial movement of Russia. I work at feminist anti-war resistance. And when the full-scale war has started, we, decolonial activists, we spoke up that this war is imperialistic war. And at that time, we were marginalized, and Russian democratic society was like, what are you talking, guys? And European society was like surprised, maybe. And now, almost 2 years have passed, and this forum is called Without Empire. And I have heard a lot of words like colonial, imperial, and like this. And I think this is huge. And I'm grateful for all speakers who brought up this point of view. As Sergei Golubok said before, all regions of Russia are colonized in economical and political terms. As Alexander Rodnyansky said yesterday, one of the main reasons why Ukraine had 6 presidents in the last 20 years and Russia only had 1 is that regions of Ukraine are equal, while regions of Russia is not equal. It is important to mention that when we speak about indigenous people of Russia, we use the term ethnic minorities. But the thing is that ethnic minorities in Russia are not small groups. Even after all ethnic cleansing and xenophobic politics of Russia, 30% of Russian population declares themselves not Russian. In reality, this group is even bigger. But I don't see us here, and I don't see that our agenda is represented by us. I am grateful that people from Moscow bring this up, but still, We spoke about Yakutia a few times on this forum, but I don't see any member, I don't see anyone from Yakutia here. There was and is now a protest movement in the regions of Russia, but few people have heard of it because it is underreported. For example, the biggest protest since the war started was in Bashkortostan. There were 5,000 people who were protecting natural resources of their region. There were few big women protests against mobilization in Yakutia and Dagestan. But still, usually people say that there are no protests in regions of Russia. Also, we all are well connected, activists from Komi Republic, from Kalmykia, Yakutia, Chechnya, Buryatia. We keep in touch and we work together. We are doing well, but we have little support. Mostly we lack support directly from European institutions. It seems that all connections are being established again through Moscow, this time Moscow opposition in exile. Part of the opposition works with us through horizontal networks between activist groups like Platform and Feminist Anti-War Resistance. Despite the huge amount of work we do, it is as we don't exist in the agenda. I don't think we could establish free Russia if we will look only in the Moscow direction. I would like European and Ukrainian politicians and the Russian opposition to ask themselves, how much do they work with the regions of Russia? How many ties do they have? How strong these ties are? Can you influence people there? Do you have access to them? Do they trust you? And another very important point that we need to understand now is that we have to be very careful when dealing with far-right nationalists in the regions, because we could end up with a new dangerous undemocratic structure if we go this way and if we will support national far-right movements of regions of Russia. My main point is we must establish more connections. Russia is not only Moscow. There are a lot of ethnic people in anti-war movement. We must work together to bring back economical and political freedoms to regions of Russia. Right now, we are hugely underrepresented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, should we move to our questions from the audience? Please. Who's first? Yeah, there you go.
Hello, my name is Lana Pelaeva. I am a Komi regional activist. And despite the fact that we are talking without empire, as just Oля mentioned, we don't have anybody here representing indigenous populations on the stage. I want to make a comment to the statement made by Anna, namely that Russian people are trying to distance themselves by saying that I'm Komi, I'm Bashkir, or whatever. I think we have to look at this from a different perspective. Before this full-scale invasion, many of us, indigenous people, we did not have the toolkit, the words to describe what we have been experiencing through the years. Now, more and more, when I talk and I tell my stories here in the West, and I hear people sharing the same experiences from Indonesia or India, I finally have this toolkit, and I understand what was happening was not okay, and is part of colonization and colonial, sorry, very nervous, colonial discourse that we have been experiencing. So at last, we know what is the problem, what is the disease, and we have now an opportunity to speak up and to bring justice to us, to our regions, and to treat the problem, this disease that Russia has been struggling at least to even accept for these generations. So that's why we need your support in addressing these questions and in raising awareness first and helping all the indigenous populations first to get hold of our land back and to work with our traumas and accept this. Thank you.
Any comments? It was, please. It was more of a comment than a question, but still.
It was a very important comment, and I think I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, which is my fault, Lana. Thank you for that, because it points to, I think, an answer to a question that's been, I think, not quite asked, but that has sort of been permeating this day, right? Which is, what can this community do? And again, look, I'm an outsider here, right? So it's not my job to tell you what you can do. It wouldn't be appropriate. But you also mentioned that you've been learning from the experiences of other exiled and diaspora communities. And that's an incredibly important thing to do. Unfortunately, a lot of those experiences have not been positive. Diasporas have struggled to maintain contact, something that somebody else mentioned, with communities on the ground. So learning from failures is also important. But there's something very positive in that as well, which is there are some things that can only, I think, be done in exile, right? That are going to be very difficult to do on the ground, but that are going to be necessary. There will eventually be an opportunity for change in Russia, and hopefully people will be able to take advantage of that. But new languages need to be learned, right? You've talked about learning those languages. It's not just the ethnic languages and the indigenous languages, but it's the language of how to talk about power within the country, right? It's also going to be a language of how to talk and listen to Ukrainians about the trauma that Russia has caused. Internal traumas, external traumas. It's going to be a difficult process. It's a process that people in the Western Balkans, people in diaspora from the Middle East have gone through. You look at Israel, Palestine, conversations that are easier to have sometimes, although still very difficult outside than inside. There is an opportunity to work on that. And in fact, a lot more opportunity to do that in these sorts of forums than anybody would be able to do on the ground in Russia now. So I would urge you to keep posing that question and to keep forcing that conversation and make sure that it happens.
Thank you. Any more questions from the audience? Or I will, okay. I wanted to use my privilege, but okay. No, please. I'm kidding. I'm just kidding.
Barbara Freitag from Prague Civil Society Center. I wanted to come back to this theme of consolidation, or what Stefan calls the sort of locked-in syndrome, as if we are in a stalemate. And I think it does require a much deeper analysis of what the factors are contributing to this. Fear is being mentioned most of the time, and I remember the Bolotnaya time when they said the cream had left, the pasta had left the tube, you know, and the pasta was the fear, and it could never be pushed back. But fear is back, that is true. But I think it isn't the only factor now dictating the dynamics. I think we have to understand, like Lev Gutkov in a very interesting interview in our leading German newspaper, referred to this whole identity question, where he says what is consolidating a society behind the state is fear also of loss of identity. If you are against this war, what else have you left to be for? Yes. So I think we haven't really understood that there is a new dynamic between state and society that is really specific in Russia, that cannot be compared, like Sergei Guriev said, to Belarus or to the other neighboring states. There is a complicity of guilt also that Putin is creating by the indoctrination that is happening. And I, as a German, can say that this sticks very heavily until you get liberated from this. This can be a strong factor for consolidation at the moment. So I would like you to go a little bit deeper and let us understand what the particular Russian dynamics are in this fear syndrome that we have, of course, in all Russia, in all repression. Thank you.
So my question is directly related, and maybe I can ask it right now, because I also actually came in the wake of the previous question, and it's about vocabulary. I'm also coming from the academic side rather than the activist side. And I was a bit surprised by the usage of the term totalitarian so freely in the discussion, because as a historian, I know there has been a decade-long debate about totalitarianism, or the term totalitarianism, and its appropriateness for using to describe any society. And I sort of fear that it's basically been dismissed as a term because it had too many, depending, I mean, of course, there's several approaches of how to be understanding totalitarianism, but in the common understanding, it had a certain kind of absolution of, because exactly it privileges the terms atomization, fear, and disprivileges the terms agency. And I think especially if one then looks at beyond the actual totalitarian state and sees what are the legacies that are coming out of conditions of oppression, repression, colonization, it isn't very helpful to think about it as a totalitarian. In every society, in every dictatorial, in every authoritarian society, you have people who get co-opted, sometimes by fear, but sometimes by incentives, sometimes by shared interests. These interests are not necessarily have to be the core ideology, which is why sometimes you can have the sudden collapses where people seem to support something for a very long time, and then suddenly it evaporates over a very short time, which we have actually seen in the case of the Soviet Union, which looked until '85 as if there was a vast deal between leadership and society and how to live, and then suddenly within 3 years, almost every single aspect was unraveled, except for, interestingly, the imperial aspect and possibly the patriotic aspect. So I think one has to be very differentiating, and I'm sort of just as a historian would say, let's not revisit these debates we had as historians for 10 years and use these terms unreflected, if actually we have now the opportunity to coin better terms.
Anyone?
So I think it needs really a more in-depth study. I think that's definitely the case. How this interaction between fear, propaganda, but also support for the state, and I think imperial legacy, which is in the society, is creating also this effect. So I think it's not just fear. It's not just the state is putting the society under pressure, but I think there is much more. There is this support also for the war and winning the war, and I think there is a special perspective also on the other neighbors, on the post-Soviet countries, on Ukraine, but also on the other countries, and I think there is a legacy of a totalitarian state. I think we should not forget this. I think it's not so far away, and it has not thought through. This is a dramatized society. If we think about the historical past also of the Soviet Union, and I think it has only started to deal with it, but not through the whole society, but in some enclaves or in some parts of the society. So I think it's also maybe easy for the state to build these links into the totalitarian past. And I would not call it a totalitarian state, but I think it has totalitarian elements, definitely. In the way there is no rights, no law, in the way how camps are used, people are jailed. I think you have a lot of elements which define also a totalitarian state, but I would be very careful to say this is a totalitarian state. It has these elements. It's still an authoritarian state. But I think it's like with other terms which might be also overused in a way and not really helpful in a way explaining what it is. But I think the specific for me is it's this imperial past which is driving the elite, and it's driving also the society or big parts of the society, and that makes it different to the other countries we just were referring to. And I think what we see now, I think, is the acceleration of the end of the empire, but it is still a society and a regime, an elite, which is thinking and behaving also in big parts, at least, in this imperial past. And I think that's a long way to go. and it's used and misused also by the state, but it's also supported by big parts of the society.
Yes, thanks very much. A couple of notes on the using of terminology and also what's so specifically Russian about the dynamics of fear. Now, as another historian, I was a long time ago, actually, late 80s, and I'm happy that I was a history student at the time because we deconstructed together with the party line at 87, 92, that I was a student. It was interesting to us to work with terminology and to suddenly realize that what we called democratic Soviet Union was apparently a totalitarian regime. And in the 90s that we had that discussion, it was always compared to the Nazi totalitarian regime. And there's a whole historiography in Russian, I'm not sure about English, but because I haven't done that in years, but sort of writing about how totalitarian societies operated, and Germany and the Soviet Union in the 30s were two examples, but usually used by specialist historians. But I am an early modern historian originally by my first training, and it's interesting to me to see how we perceive terminology. Now, Moscow Principality in the 17th century was dubbed as authoritarian, but French monarchy was absolutist, and England was fighting against tyranny. And we could go on and on how we perceive those terms, especially in a historical perspective from today. What is important, I think, is that every generation or every sort of decade, I don't know how you call that, I hate generational discourse, that we learn new set of terms or we develop the new set of terms that we're happy about. Now it's all about decolonization, great. We did decolonization in the 90s, it wasn't enough, apparently because of imperial heritage or whatever happened. We're back to that again. I'm actually very happy that we're coming to this terminology and we're coming to this discussion and again. And of course, as a feminist who decolonize every day, because that's what we do in our positioning all the time, I'm pretty happy that finally some other parts of the society got it. Answering, you know, in a view of talking about terminology, answering that what's so specifically Russian about this dynamics of fear, what if there's nothing specifically Russian about it? What if this society is going through the configuration of circumstances that other societies gone through? Argentina was mentioned, Brazil was mentioned, Latin America actually. What if about decolonized African societies that what if we need to learn, in fact, from these practices, decolonization, rather than to invent yet again exotic and specific Russian dynamic that actually never existed? And that is the other question we need to be asking. Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not what it is, but every time you have that, okay, what's so specific about this war? What's specifically Russian about this war? What if it's an imperial war? Thank you, Olga, who actually sort of continued the feminist thought on that. And what if we actually don't need to really go into that, but we need to actually do something else, and probably that would be more productive in our conversation.
We have a couple more comments on totalitarianism, right? Hits the nerve every time.
I think we've heard enough.
I think we certainly can call Russia totalitarian, but I think it's not very useful because we kind of not using very accurate terminology then. A useful way to distinguish between authoritarianism and totalitarianism is to say that totalitarianism, one of the features of it is this high level of mobilization, high level of ideologization. And this is, I don't think that contemporary Russia reaches that level of mobilization. I'm not even sure that the regime tries to achieve that level. I have an intuition that probably it kind of afraid of it. Because, for example, one of the things Prigozhin promoted was exactly this kind of totalitarian project, like let's turn the country into North Korea and so on. And yeah, we know what happened. We don't know what happened to him, but yeah, something happened to him. So yeah, I think it is useful to keep totalitarianism in our vocabulary for other situations.
Thank you, thank you. We actually have a couple of questions from our online app, and I think the first one can be addressed to Madame Katzarova. It's about repressions. what impact is technological repression, for example, VPN blockage, facial recognition, etc., having on civil society, overall society inside Russia today? Do you consider it will have any permanent, irreversible effect on the future of democratic outcomes in Russia, just as it has been implemented in China?
Well, it's one of the tools of the authorities for silencing independent voices or for silencing people from accessing any alternative way of information. So I don't think it's unique to Russia, but I think it's a very important discussion to have, and I will be looking into more specifically, I mean, I just submitted my first report, but in the future, I would like to look into all the variety of technological tools and ways of creating, you know, this brainwashing of the people, but also preventing the ones that are dissident-minded from accessing information. So I don't know what it's meant, whether it's permanent. Nothing is permanent in the world, you know. Whether it's permanent, I don't know.
Yeah, it's just, there's a comparison to China. I think that's kind of...
I'm not an expert on China, but it's not unique to Russia. But I think it's very, very worrying. I'm going to New York next, in a week's time, to speak at the General Assembly. But one of the things I'm going to do is actually to meet somebody I know at Meta, because I want to have a conversation with them how we could support, and they could support, through their work as a huge multi-billion business, but other businesses as well. It's their responsibility as well, how to support you know, the independent thinking, the access to information, to support civil society, the Russian civil society, precisely how to counteract all of these tools of repression, in fact, yes. And I also wanted to add, before we get too intellectual, I'm sorry, I'm not an academic. I never wanted to be one. I'm a practitioner of human rights, and I want to say it doesn't matter how we call it. Because you know what gives me hope is Miss Kara-Murza, who is the mother of Vladimir, who is here in the audience, and I want to honor her today. This is the mom of Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is in prison for 25 years. Whatever we call it in academic circles, for me, what happens to her son is the ultimate violation of human rights, the ultimate repression, only because he spoke truth to power, because he was brave enough, like so many others, to do that, and many in this room. Elena, could you please stand up so we could applaud you? And we applaud Vladimir. We applaud Vladimir through you. Thank you. So beyond the academic discourse, we need to support these people, and we need to support the indigenous activists, because they are feeling even more isolated, and the women indigenous activists. So whatever you call it, the situation with human rights in Russia is grave. It's very serious. And what Russia will be tomorrow and its people depends on us today. Not only the Russians, but all of us as international community.
Thank you. And the second question, it is said to address it to Sam, but I think that anyone who wants can reply too. Are there still reliable ways to get an accurate pulse of public opinion in Russia, or are all those avenues now closed? Tell us about your tools, please.
Yes, I think there are, but I think that what the current situation does is it forces us to do things better that we should have been doing before, and that I think some people were doing before, or at least trying to, which is to think more deeply about what our data are actually reflecting, right? And I was trying to talk about this a little bit, but the reality is that we have tended to interpret an opinion poll the way that we interpret the weather report, right? That it's an accurate reflection of sort of particles moving around in a system that obeys the laws of physics, right? Which is not the way society works, right? The reality is that the measurement is some distance away from the cause and effect process. Sorry, I'm going to be very academic, right? But that actually gets there. So there's one thing that causes somebody to be aware of an event, and then another thing that causes them to think about it a certain way, and then another thing that causes them to decide how they're going to express that, and then another thing that causes them to decide whether they're going to respond to the survey, and then another thing that causes them to decide whether they're going to respond to the survey honestly. And then, of course, their opinion can change from one moment to the next, right? The way I feel about something when the weather's nice versus the way I feel about it when it's not, right, can be different, right? So we need to be aware, right, that what we see in the data is a reflection of all of those very complicated processes reduced to one single data point, right, which is very difficult to interpret if we're not coming at it from multiple angles. So we need to be looking at the opinion polls, right, together with what we're seeing on social media. We can observe conversations online, right, to what we're seeing in terms of behavior or lack of behavior in the street, what we're seeing in terms of what the regime is responding for. They're collecting a lot more data than any of us are able to individually, right, and they're making decisions about how to respond to that. So that's another data point, right? We need to be not just triangulating, but whatever the, 8 times version of that is. I'm not a mathematician. To figure out what our level of confidence is, right, in any of this information, and to understand that the phenomena that we're looking at are incredibly complex. The second thing we need to stop doing is just because we see a big number, right, 70%, 75%, 65%, to assume that that reflects uniformity, right? The pathway that takes individuals from being individuals to being part of that 70% that supports the war is going to be different for different people, right? We've talked about diversity already, right? But the reality is that that's not happening on an individual level, and it's not 70% of the Russian population coming into Red Square and having a brainwave implanted into their head, right? It is millions, tens of millions of kitchen table conversations. It's tens of millions of workplace conversations, school conversations, social group conversations, online conversations, right? Some of which are going to turn on ideology and imperialism, others of which are going to turn on patriotism, others of which are going to turn on conformism, others of which are going to turn on something that I can't even think of at the moment, right? So we need to understand that this is, even if we're seeing uniformity of behavior, it's still a highly diverse society and a highly diverse set of social experiences. So we need to break down that number and look at people as individuals, as social groups, as communities, however they're constructed.
Thank you. Well, we're very good, in terms of time. Thank you very much. We have a couple more minutes for the questions, please.
Kristina Shanok, Office of Belarus Democratic Forces in the Czech Republic. This panel is about dynamics, about tendencies, and we speak not only about people inside the country, but also about those who left the country after the full-scale invasion. And my question is related to these new members of diaspora, let's say diaspora. Ms. Kuleshova said that there are no representatives, and it's a problem, and they feel it as a problem. I can confirm it on the example of Czechia, where there are a lot of restrictions towards students from Russia, but also from Belarus. And Russian students have a tendency to ask Belarusian representatives to promote their cases, to advocate their cases. And I don't see this in a positive way because I'm asking myself what is lacking, what is missing, why Russian communities abroad, where no restrictions in comparison to Russia, are not able to set this representation, even in case of young people, which are future of, let's say, Russian Federation. So what is lacking? Why?
I think that we should make another one research to answer your question. because I'm not ready to answer it right now. We should think about it, especially, it wasn't the point of our research, and now it's maybe my colleagues who want to comment it. Yeah?
I just refer to the research that's, I have a PhD student who's doing the female migration, academic migration from Russia to abroad in the past 2 years. And I skipped the theoretical part, you know, so we're not getting bored. But that's actually going to be the absence of solidarity that people who, and actually Anna said something about it, that people who migrate, especially students, and we're not talking about other sectors of a society, although other sectors of a society are pretty much sort of similar in their opinion, they do not create, they do not have a very strong diaspora feeling and or diaspora sort of solidarity compared to other countries, for example. Mostly, she explains, her name is Larisa Prakovskaya, so if you're interested, could check her publication. So she explains that we don't have a strong sense of identity and national identity to carry us through being abroad because of basically the idea that we are European in a way that we share European values, those at least who leave or left after February 22, but not the communities before because there is a difference also between the old so-called migration people who left in the previous decades. So at least for what, for what it is, that's her findings in research, so you can check her work.
And just a short comment, maybe, maybe that's because of feeling guilty, I think. Maybe they are not sure in themselves and they are not sure that they ask about any kind of help and they are not sure that they understand the whole situation and they understand that first of all Ukraine should, people from Ukraine should get help, and so they just do not let themselves to speak about it and to ask about any kind of help, maybe.
Yes, thank you for this question. I've been very worried, and not recently, but because in my previous role, I was leading for 1 year the investigation mandate of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on the brutalities after the presidential elections in Belarus in 2020. And I think somebody should do a research, because there are so many academics here, on the impact of policies in European Union countries, and maybe beyond European Union countries, where in this attempt to kind of have a carpet approach or a collective punishment approach to Belarusians and to Russians after the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian authorities. A lot of Belarusian students, their visas, their student status has been cancelled in many European countries. And these were the democratic youth. These were the people who participated in the peaceful and beautiful Belarusian revolution, which was actually without arms, and they were punished for that by torture, by rape, in Okrestina, in Zhodina, in all the places of detention, and shot at by the military and police of the government of Mr. Lukashenko. How many of these young students, because they lost their status in European countries, had to return into the hands of the government, who not only has been looking at, they have videos. There is one of the ways the Belarusian secret police have been operating. They've been going to people who participated in the peaceful events, demonstrations of 2020, because they're on a video or they're on photographs, which they've been documenting all of the protesters. And I want to know how many of these young people from all these European countries ended up brutalized, re-brutalized by the Belarusian government. And now it's going to happen also to the Russians, to the Russian students. I mean, who are we punishing and for what? In international law, there is no collective punishment and there is no collective guilt. There are concrete perpetrators. There are concrete perpetrators that take the decisions, concrete perpetrators that follow criminal orders. This is in all branches of international law, from criminal law to human rights law to international humanitarian law. And I think we should stick with international law in this moment, with this situation and with the war on Ukraine as well, and not try to punish the people of Russia or the people of Belarus, and particularly the democratic activists, the human rights defenders, the ones that tomorrow will be building Belarus, rebuilding Russia, because otherwise we will be creating what is happening in the other part of the world right now with the brutality and complete despicable violence in Palestine and Israel. Because terrorists, I'm completely convinced, are born out of desperation and out of societies that were turned into ghettos with no human rights, with no respect for humanity. And this is when we see the birth of terrorists and desperate people who are ready to kill, who are not educated, who are ready to decimate everybody because they don't have a sense of their own dignity and their own worth. Let's not make another ghetto or another, despicable black hole here in Europe by Russia or by Belarus, because they're very, very brave people who are living inside and outside. And we need to protect them here to continue their work. Do you know how difficult it is in Germany to open a bank account if you're a Russian citizen? Or if you're a Russian NGO, human rights defender? Or to register your organization to continue your work here? These are the policy questions that we need to advocate in front of our governments. So you have your tasks. What could be done?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm being told that we're out of time and cannot take any more questions. Thank you very much for the insights you shared. There's definitely a lot to think about. Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for your moderation as well. I take individual responsibility is not gone. Very good. The only thing I feel, I don't want to say things, but as I lived the last 3 years in Jerusalem, I want to say that also every terrorist who takes deliberate decision to kill civilians has an individual choice and is not only a person out of circumstance. And because individual choice is what we all talk about here, it will be exciting to go from this analysis and this many elements that we heard. Thank you so much again, everyone.